Welcome to Elizabeth Reads. We are reading A Place Called Perfect. We are on chapter 17, Deadly Cold. Violet got up and, keeping her left hand against the wall, tiptoed after her friend. As they neared the bottom of the stairwell, light trickled up from a doorway below. She held her breath. Any sound could wake the sleeping watchers. Boy entered the freezing room first. Violet followed, though her legs wanted to run the other way. The space was huge, lit only by a battery torch dangling from the end of a rope that was tied to a nail in the ceiling. The torch cast a circular glow round the center of the room. About 20 rope hammocks hung from rusted hooks bolted to the stone above. All were empty except for 3, occupied by the sleeping watchers. Violet tiptoed round the hammocks past an upturned wooden crate that sat directly under the torch, where a card game was laid out ready to play. Carefully she stepped over dirty uniforms and stinking giant leather boots that littered the middle of the floor. She held her nose to block out the sweaty stench. "Down here," Boy whispered, ducking into a passageway at the far side of the room. It was dark, but Boy didn't dare light the torch he still held in his grasp as they moved quickly on, keeping close to the wall for comfort. A little further down the tunnel, Violet's fingers brushed over a cold slime. The walls were wet. Trickles of water ran down the stone, forming small pools on the flagstone floor. It was freezing cold, and Violet wrapped her arms around herself in a vain attempt to combat the falling temperature. "Listen," Boy said, stopping suddenly in front of her. "Do you hear that?" "What?" Violet asked. "That noise, like running water. We must be under the river," he whispered. "What river?" "The river that marks the furthest edges of no man's land. There are walls on 3 sides and the river on the 4th. We must be underneath it now." "Underneath it? So it's above us? What if the stones can't hold it in? What if the walls burst and we drown?" Violet said, panic filling her throat. "Violet!" Boy raised his voice to a loud whisper. "You don't half exaggerate. Does this tunnel look new to you?" She shook her head and tried to calm the racing thoughts swirling around her mind. "Exactly," he said. "It's centuries old. If the walls have kept the river out this long, I'm pretty sure they're not going to fall in on us now." Boy's words made sense, and Violet told herself to relax as they continued on their journey. Where had her bravery gone? She'd been determined to find out what Bungalow was up to earlier, but now she was worried they'd gotten in a bit too deep. She wished they could just find her dad and leave. "Have you ever crossed the river out of no man's land?" Violet asked, trying to distract her thoughts. "No," Boy said. "It's almost impossible. There's only one footbridge and it's falling down. The watchers patrol the other side too. I've heard rumors of people trying to escape across it." "What happened to them?" "They were caught by the watchers and nobody ever saw them again." Violet didn't ask any more questions, and they walked in silence as the ground beneath them began to slope gradually upwards like they were heading for the surface. A slight breeze tickled her ankles and a mist seeped into the tunnel, filling the stone space, its icy tongue licking Violet's skin. She searched out Boy's hand in the darkness. He was shivering. "Are you okay?" she whispered. He didn't reply. "Boy, please, you're frightening me. Where are we?" "Do you hear them?" His voice was weak. "Who?" Violet moved closer, wrapping her arm around his. It felt as if someone was watching them. She looked behind her, but could see nothing in the thick black. "Do you hear the voices, Violet?" Boy sounded desperate. "What voices? It's just the wind. Please, Boy, you're scaring me." "They're crying. I think they're crying, Violet." "Who's crying? Please, Boy, stop it." There was a rustle behind her. Violet panicked. Letting go of Boy's arm, she sprinted for the light that trickled down into the tunnel ahead, outlining stone steps in the darkness. She rushed up the steps until her head broke through an opening above her into the night air. She squeezed her arms through the gap and wiggled out onto soggy grass, using her elbows. A few moments later, Boy struggled through onto the grass beside her. "Where are we?" she whispered. He didn't answer. His face was as white as her mother's starched sheets, and it scared Violet. To steady her beating heart, she ignored him and looked around. When she turned back, Boy was gone. "No, please stop! Boy, don't! It's a graveyard!" she stuttered, climbing to her feet. High crosses and half tombstones appeared to float in the fog either side of a stone path a little way away from her. The path cut straight through the graveyard. She could just make out Boy's gray shadow in the fog, and she followed him. She had no choice. Gingerly, she stepped round the graves to reach the path that was cracked and patterned in weeds. To steady herself, she counted them as she walked. 1 dandelion, 2 daisies, 2 dandelions. Ouch! Something sharp sliced the skin on her forearm. A rusted nail protruded from an old wooden stake. She looked up and screamed. A human skull was impaled on top of the stake, and a roughly scrawled sign was nailed to the wood below. "Keep out if you know what's good for you." "Please, Boy, please, can we get out of here?" she cried. The panic in her voice must have raised Boy from his trance, and within seconds he appeared back through the mist. "Violet, are you okay? What's wrong?" he panted. As she pointed to the sign, something clattered up ahead. Boy grabbed her arm and yanked her down behind a broken stone cross. "Stay here," he whispered. She nodded, her voice stolen. Boy began to move away, and she grabbed his sleeve. "I have to check the voices out," he said, gently shaking her off. "One of them could be George. I'll be back in a minute, I promise." He was gone. She was alone. "Everything will be okay. Everything will be okay. Everything will be okay," Violet repeated. There was a rustle behind her. She closed her eyes, every muscle tensed. She couldn't move. Suddenly, something scuttled over her foot, and she squeaked and darted backwards. A large rat rested at the base of the cross, gnawing on a bone. She panicked and ran blindly. A wall surrounding the graveyard emerged out of the mist ahead, and she scrambled across the graves towards it. Clambering over the top, she fell down the other side onto a bed of mossy grass. As she sat with her back to the stone wall, her fears engulfed her. Maybe Boy was right. She should never have got involved. More than ever, she wished they hadn't come to Perfect. She wished none of this had happened. What if her mom just didn't love her anymore? What if her dad had disappeared on purpose? Maybe he had another family, or maybe he didn't love her either, and that's why he left. Maybe it had nothing to do with Perfect. She'd blamed the Archers for everything when really it was all her own fault. Her heart sank, pulling heavily on her chest. Every terrible thought she could imagine ate away at her until life seemed so bleak she couldn't see an escape. She looked round for Boy. The mist had thickened. He'd left her too. Everyone who meant anything had gone. They'd all abandoned her. Pulling her knees towards her chest, she wrapped her arms around them, shielding herself from the outside. Soon the mist cocooned her from the world. She cried for her mom and dad, for the friends she'd lost, for Boy and his lack of parents. She cried for all the bad things she had ever heard about in school, like homeless people or the starving children in Africa. And she cried for herself. This was how Boy found her. "Violet," he panted, sitting down. "I was looking everywhere for you." She didn't look at him. She was angry and didn't want him to see her cry. "Where were you? You left me." "I'm sorry," he pleaded. "I didn't leave you. I went to see where the voices were coming from. I thought George Archer was there." "But you left me in the graveyard." "I'm sorry," said Boy, shamefaced. "I didn't think. Did you find them, the voices?" "No," Boy sighed, his face still white. "I'm not sure they were real." Violet shivered as the pair sat shoulder to shoulder in silence. The air grew thicker, and a distant clap of thunder rumbled across the sky. "Violet," Boy whispered a while later. "Please look at me," he said, wiping the tears from his red eyes. "I know how you feel. It's this place. It brings out every bad thought you've ever had. I've heard about it before, but I never believed the stories until now." "What do you mean?" "I'll show you," he said, getting to his feet and pulling Violet up from the soggy grass. "We have to be quiet, really quiet." A blinking street lamp rested on the crest of the hill ahead, yellowing the mists. They stumbled up the grassy rise towards it along a narrow path that had been worn into the hillside. "It looks like we're not the only people who've come this way," Violet whispered. Boy nodded but stayed silent. Nearing the top, he pulled on her arm and signaled her to copy him. Quietly, he got onto his knees and crawled up what remained of the hill, stopping by the street lamp. Violet followed suit and was soon by his side, her elbows and knees sopping wet. From the top of the hill, they could see down into a small valley. A row of rusty steel street lamps dotted along a cracked cement footpath dimly lit the scene below. Just off the footpath on one side were a group of unfinished cement block homes. Some had just cavities for windows or doors, while two were shells without even a roof. Bits of steel fencing and old machinery decorated the weed-filled gardens at the front of the half-finished homes. The place was nothing like the old world of Perfect or No Man's Land. It was modern and reminded Violet of the housing estate she lived in before she came to Perfect, except this one had never been finished. Off the other side of the footpath was a black tarmac road that circled around a green common area in the middle of the houses. Strange plants were growing in the green, about 50 rows of them. Their flower heads had white petals and were bent over as if sheltering from a driving rain, while their thick stems were colored a deep blood red. They were about as tall as sunflowers. "Where are we?" Violet whispered. Boy pointed across the park. "Look over there." Violet followed his finger and noticed 2 crumbling cement block pillars marking what must have been an entrance. Beside the pillars was a faded billboard picture of a happy family. Each smiling parent carried a child on their shoulders towards a house that looked the exact same as the houses below them, except for one thing. It was finished. Giant faded letters across the top of the billboard read, "Set your family up for life." Violet nodded. "If you go through the pillars and follow the road, it leads back to the footbridge I was telling you about, the broken one into no man's land. So we did cross under the river. But where are we, boy? What is this place?" "It's whispered about in no man's land." "What do they say?" Violet quivered. "That it's full of bad luck. Some say it's where the Watchers punish people during the rebellions. Others tell darker stories about the graveyard and its bloody history. Most say it's what?" Violet asked, her fear rising. "It's haunted," Boy whispered. "People call it the Ghost Estate." And that's the end of the chapter. Please subscribe and you can know when the next chapter comes out. Bye-bye.